Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on HVSBL podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Robyn Faith Walsh. And today we'll be discussing a little bit about what she's presenting at SBL, but I'm also going to ask some questions about her book. And also, if you feel a link to it, will be in the description below. With that being said, thank you for joining me today, Robyn.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's nice to see you in person.
Yeah, likewise. Can you tell us a little bit about from whom the Codex tolls the cult of difficulty in the Gospel of Mark?
So this is for a forthcoming volume, and the session was basically previewing what we're going to be working on. But my central interest in that session is how do we classify the Gospels in terms of their use of koine, and how do we understand the first and second centuries and what we see as the shift from, or between this Atticizing tendency within Greek and the second sophistic. So there's sort of this middle region where the Gospels slot in. And I think there's a tendency within the field to think that anything in koine is, sometimes the terms you'll actually see are things like vulgar or street Greek. I actually quoted a scholar that I won't say who it was in the paper who said, well, only the uneducated are forced to use koine. And when you think about that, it's kind of an odd statement. How are the educated, the people writing uneducated, and how are they being forced to use this particular register? So I wanted to investigate that a little bit more. And the reason it's for whom the Codex tolls is that it's always struck me that we make all these pronouncements about koine and make all these assumptions about it, especially with someone like the Gospel of Mark, whoever wrote the Gospel of Mark. But nobody ever says that about someone like Ernest Hemingway, who really brought in a new kind of writing from this modernism, what's typically called the cult of difficulty. James Joyce, Gertrude Stein, writers like this. He really brought in, because of his journalistic background and his style, was, as he would say himself, anybody with a high school education can read what I'm writing. But no one would say he's uneducated. No one would say he's just writing street English, or that he's not engaged with the writing community around him, because he was part of Gertrude Stein's salon in Paris. He's very much part of this really elite group of writers, and one of the greatest writers, considered one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. So I was interested in doing that comparison. Now, a little bit of background is they asked me to do something creative for this. I was just going to sort of do almost like a phenomenological comparison. But my point was, let's talk about a writer who's closer to home with Hemingway, and then go back and reconsider how we talk about koine with the Gospel of Mark. But they asked me to do something a little bit more creative because I had just published an article in the Journal for the Historical Jesus called The Mouse of the Mysteries, where I pretended it's 4025, and I have a scholarly alter ego who's an archaeologist who has uncovered in Orlando, Florida, the remains of what they think is some kind of cult site to a pan-global mouse god, and that in domestic structures all over the world, we're also finding votives of this mouse god. And I basically write this whole entire scholarly article, and I used AI for the images of the archaeological sites and the findings, the small finds, apotropaic mouse watches and things like that. So I wrote a whole article in that persona, and it was really a pedagogical comment on mistakes we can make if we overread our evidence. So the editors read Mouse of the Mysteries, and they asked me to mouse Hemingway somehow. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what I would do. And in the course of reading about koine, reading about shifts in literary tone, some people use the word register, in the period, that first, second century, I started reading Lucian's on how to write history. And some of his advice for how to write a good history or any other kind of writing sound a lot like the Gospels. It's a little strange. I mean, down to don't put your name on it. Direct sentences, have like a chain, just talk about events one after the other. Don't use too much flourish. If you're talking about a landscape, don't overdo it. Don't show off too much. Don't have long titles. So I started to think actually Hemingway and Lucian would have a lot to talk about best practices and good Greek style, even if you're not Atticizing the way the second sophistic does with their Greek. Even writers in koine are doing many of the same things. So my paper ended up being a fictional dialogue between Lucian and Hemingway on how to write properly, or best practices, or how to avoid editorial fatigue, which was the title of the session. So I managed to mouse Hemingway in some way, and everything that the two of them recommend, the implication is that that's what the gospel writers do in their work.
That kind of reminds me a bit of your book when you're examining the origins of Christianity in the Greco-Roman context.
Yeah.
You brought up Lucian and how Lucian helps in some way understand the Gospel of Mark, even though Lucian's obviously not a Christian.
And he's obviously much later.
Right.
Right.
Can you expand a bit more on how Lucian helps us understand the Gospels?
Yeah, so, he's a satirist, so I should say that right off the bat. So he's making jokes a lot of the time. He's actually really, really funny. And I make the joke that if I had encountered Lucian earlier, I think I would be in a different career path, possibly, because I could just sit and read him and laugh like a nerd. But he really represents the height of the second sophistic, I find, in many ways, both in terms of his skill, but in terms of his engagement. And again, because it's satire, it's like The Daily Show or something. Sometimes the humor is more on point, if you get it, than any other kind of sober analysis. So because he's later, it's a little bit hard to connect him to the Gospels, except for a couple of things. One is I feel that he really represents the pinnacle of that kind of commentary later on, right? So he can do kind of a retrospective for us. Like, he hits the benchmark of like somebody who's talking about these issues and doing it really, really well for us to understand what's been going on in the development of Greek literature over that time period. But also, he has, in his Passing of Peregrinus, another satirical piece that he wrote, there's this figure, Peregrinus, for a while, actually joins a Christian group and becomes so successful, apparently, that he was one of these major leaders, almost on par with Jesus in some circles. The thing about this story, though, is that he's on the lam because he's been committing a variety of crimes I won't detail. Someone can go read. And the law keeps catching up to him. And the implication is essentially he wants to try to find notoriety somewhere. So he's, I think, a cynic for a while. He's a Christian for a while. Eventually, he lights himself on fire at the Olympic Games. And we have historical attestation of this. Apparently, he's a real person. So he lights himself on fire at the Olympic Games, and he finally gets the fame he was always looking for. At least that's how Lucian tells it. But Lucian's aware of Christians, which is interesting. He's not talking about their literature, but he knows they exist. So he's an interesting person to look at if you're going to be talking about things like craft, which I was doing in this paper, but also in general thinking about later manifestations of Christianity and how it's understood outside of Christian circles.
What does he say about Christians?
Well, Peregrinus, he basically says they're gullible. He says some of the things that you would expect about they share things in common. And one of the reasons that he chooses them when he's on the lam is because he knows they'll pay his legal bills. So because they kind of, they pool their money and they share things and they take care of each other, they're a good mark for a con artist, essentially. So they come across as sort of maybe naive a little bit, I think, in his text, but he's eventually kicked out because he doesn't follow the dietary laws properly. So they eventually catch on to him. So he doesn't say too much, but enough to be interesting.
Do you still think that Q existed?
I don't know for sure. There certainly seems to be enough evidence there to sustain it. Whether or not, the thing for me is that if it did exist, claims that it's before the war, I'm not so sure about. So I think the way that it functions as a theory is to create a chain or a connection to what we would call the historical Jesus. So you can have Q's bridge that gap between Jesus and his followers, or even Paul, who probably has nothing to do with it, but at least that era, all the way to when the Gospels are written, which we all know are post 70, right? And I mean, some people are pushing this into the 2nd century now, that the Gospels are actually 2nd century. So if you have Q as this hypothetical source, you have, and it's associated with oral tradition, right? And then some Q scholars even put it into different layers. So, the wisdom community, the eschatological community, right? The different themes that come up in Q, people will associate with different communities and traditions and even groups. And so it becomes functionally a way to create some kind of genealogy from maybe the earliest groups or some oral tradition to the Gospels. That's the part I find suspicious, because I think it's a stand-in for more apologetic ways of understanding the content of the Gospels. And I don't see a great reason that we have to date it so early. Because, I mean, imagine people are right, the Gospels are 2nd century. Why does Q have to be 50s, right? It could be post-war too, because it has, per the eschatological side, some indications it could be reflecting on the Jewish war as well. So if it existed, I would say it's later.
And that would make sense of statements that it makes, like, something about your house is empty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or on sand. I think the temple's on sand or something. I think that passage is in there too. So, yeah, I think there's good reason to doubt or to question.
Now, in the Q material, in the double tradition material, regardless if it existed as a separate document as Q at one point or not, do you see a bunch of things in there that fit within the Greco-Roman context, like that's inspired by Greco-Roman literature?
Well, I mean, certainly a collection of sayings of a teacher. I mean, Pythagoras, right? There's nothing particularly unique about that. So to the extent that it reflects the kind of practice you see in other philosophical groups, absolutely, at least as far as we know.
Does Matthew and Luke having birth stories, genealogies attributed to Jesus, do you also see parallels in Greco-Roman literature?
You have that with a lot of major hero figures, and in biographies, that's fairly typical. There are some atypical things about the Gospels, and I won't give away that Dennis MacDonald's behind the camera, but he might have something to say about this too. I mean, it's a little peculiar, for instance, that we don't have a description of Jesus physically, right? Because there are some formulaic things you expect. Genealogies, birth narrative, some kind of, who was this person's teacher? You get that with Alexander, for example. I mean, we get down to how Alexander smelled. So there are some atypical aspects, but the genealogy, the birth narrative, yeah, that's pretty typical. I mean, the idea that the god sneaks in dressed as the husband or something along those lines, and that explains why the hero's the way he is. That's pretty usual.
Which Greco-Roman mythological figures would you say remind you more of Jesus, or Greco-Roman characters in general?
Alexander does a little bit, because even the way, say, Plutarch writes his life of Alexander, you have some of the wonder elements in it where he's exceptional, but also there's a little bit more of a focus on some of the mundane things about his life. And I think to some extent, you have a little bit of that with Jesus, right? You definitely have like the major aspects of Jesus's life, but he's mostly just walking around teaching and performing small acts, and depending on which gospel you're talking about. So I think that's one thing that stands out to me. And by the way, it's something Lucian recommends, that you don't focus on big events, that you focus on little things too.
Could you name a few more characters that you think remind you of the way the Gospels portray Jesus? Socrates
is another one, especially his death. Let me see, who else? Apollonius of Tyana would be another one. I think there's probably some touchstones with Pythagoras as well, and then Homer. Again, looking at Dennis over there. I think that especially when you think about the literary sources, but what would be influencing the gospel writers, I think all of that is, all that stands out to me.
What were some of the major parallels that really got you going down the path of examining the Greco-Roman origins of the Gospels, like in the Greco-Roman context?
Oh, well, okay, so there's two ways to answer that. The first is to talk about structurally. Something that I was interested in was moving us away from always thinking about the Gospels as somehow Jewish literature. And obviously, in some respects, they are, right? I mean, they're citing the Septuagint, and it's obviously a major influence on the Gospels. But by focusing in that direction, I think sometimes scholarship errs on the side of what I would call exceptionalism. So it treats the Gospels as some kind of exceptional form of writing or a new kind of genre that came onto the scene that almost had no precedent anywhere. But by turning to Greco-Roman literature, so someone like Richard C. Miller or someone like Dennis MacDonald working on motifs, on tropes, on structure, narrative structure that you could see in the Gospels that mirrors what's going on elsewhere in the Greco-Roman world, that is key. And to remember that these Gospel writers have enough Greek that they were educated somewhere, sometime, in some capacity, what's traditionally called paideia. They learned off of these other writers. They're writing in Greek. They learned off of Homer. They learned off of philosophy. They learned off of other biographies that are around it, whenever you think they were authored. And there are certain structural elements that they definitely mirror. We've talked about a few here already. Something like including a genealogy is one of them, or a birth narrative. And so I think to not understand that we have to situate them within that arc of literature is a mistake. So, Empty Tomb was something that I talked about. I was struck in my book by how many things I saw in the Satyricon that also thematically appear in the Gospels, including 3 men crucified in an empty tomb and a funerary meal with Trimalchio, saying that he wanted, after his death, he hears a cock crow and he says, after my death, I want my friends to divide my body and eat it. I mean, you have all kinds, and those are all what are usually called Milesian tales. And so these were stories that were around before the 1st century in some form or another, being compiled essentially in the Satyricon. So those were things that stood out to me when I was working on this.
When the Gospels are trying to reimagine the historical Jesus within the Greco-Roman context, is that to make Jesus compete, imitate, and be better than other Greco-Roman heroes?
Probably. I have been thinking more about the social situation of the Gospel authors. Sometimes I worry that we overuse the concept of competition. I don't know if it's so much competition as this is just what you do. And so if you want to convey that Jesus is on par with some of these other figures, these are the kind of teachings. This is the kind of activity. Of course, his body would be missing afterwards. In a way, it's kind of showing his place within this panoply of wondrous characters. It's also playing into things people like in this period, from what we can tell in terms of literature, things like wonder stories. People love miracle stories. People love, in this period, paradoxography, which is this form of literature. We give it this title, but it's basically paradoxographers, scholars of this don't like this, but I'm gonna use this analogy. Ripley's Believe It or Not. So, or when I was growing up, in supermarkets, when you actually did have like magazines and newspapers at the end of the aisle, there was something called the News of the World. I loved the News of the World. And there was this serial story, this Bat Boy found in cave. I actually have a Bat Boy t-shirt. I loved Bat Boy. So you'd have they found this Bat Boy and they had some kind of like puppet they made that looked like a bat child. And they would like tell you like, oh, Bat Boy got out again. It was completely all made up. Like dinosaurs are real. Everything was made up in this magazine. And I don't know where it went. I mean, I think it just died like the rest of print. But this thing was fantastic. And it was entertainment. But it was also, like you didn't really believe there was a Bat Boy, but you're sort of like, you can go engage this fantasy world, right, where these things could be possible. And so paradoxography, it's too trite to say it was like News of the World or Ripley's Believe It or Not, but it was a way it's like almost a travel log. It was a way to find out about far off places you're never going to see, you can only imagine about, maybe you've only heard about randomly, but you hear about extraordinary things that can happen there, or extraordinary things that are going on in spaces you don't have access to. So they used to say things like, there's a centaur that was found in such and such a place. They embalmed it and brought it back to the emperor, and it's now in his storehouse. Like, you can never prove that, but it's interesting to think about, right? So in a period where these wonder tales are really compelling, to hear about this far-off land, Judea, with this guy who has these essentially magical powers, again, like just to kind of use some shorthand, but is able to do these really extraordinary things, heal people, multiply food, to, talk to spirits, to cast them into swine, like all of these things fit, I think, within that scope of interest for people.
So how many Greco-Roman heroes actually have a story about a missing body?
Well, Miller had some number, like 120 or something like that. I found even more when I was doing my research, in part because I also looked at the Greek novel, which I don't know that there's been enough comparison to the Greek novel, which arises roughly the same period that we ballpark the Gospels. And they're often written in Latin too, just so people know to call them the Greek novels is just kind of a shorthand. But they were essentially like proto-Shakespearean romantic novels. And they have things like empty tombs all the time. So I think I talked about, might have been Keraton was one, where it's a star-crossed lover story where, young boy and girl, their eyes meet, they fall in love. She dies under some kind of mysterious circumstances. She's put in a tomb. Her would-be boyfriend goes to the tomb when he hears that she's died to pay respect to her, and her body's missing from the tomb. Turns out pirates raided the tomb, stole all the jewels, and took her too. But he automatically thinks, oh, she's become a god. That's what happened. Which god stole my girlfriend to make her his girlfriend? So those kinds of stories were also prolific. And so to the things that Miller adds about deities and, the usual thing, the apotheosis, emperors, or I think Asclepius might even, I'm glancing at Dennis to see, but I think there are other Pan-Hellenic heroes that even get this kind of the body disappears story, but also obviously emperors. They would look for cosmic signs too, which are present in the Gospels, that there's some kind of earthquake, some kind of shooting star, some kind of comet, something that indicates to you that, the individual whose body has disappeared has shot off to heaven, what we might call heaven, or there's some kind of cosmic event that has taken place. That's something you see in the Gospels too.
It makes one wonder if that's where they got the inspiration from to create that.
Totally.
Right.
Of course. Of course. But they would say, I think I can't remember which one, but there's a Roman emperor where there was a comet after he died, and everyone was like, oh, there he is. This was pretty typical.
It was either Julius Caesar or Augustus.
Yeah, was it Caesar?
Okay. The first one was right.
Yeah. So, this is just, it's just what happens. So the idea that you would have an earthquake or something like that shows the power and weight of what's taken place, totally normal.
Do you see this as complicating or helping to understand, to try to, in any attempt to reconstruct the historical Jesus by separating all that which was clearly added to his character from the Greco-Roman context?
I'm increasingly convinced that anything we would want to call the historical Jesus is pretty lost to us, save some large strokes. So, that he existed, he was a Judean, that he had some kind of a following, that I tend to suspect it was more of maybe kind of rebellious sort of group along the lines of what Josephus describes with some of these other sons of God claiming some kind of exalted status to fight against their occupation. But I think that beyond kind of understanding that he was probably a teacher type of some kind, there's not much that we can really know. But I think that is a function of our expectations not lining up with what these people were trying to do. I think that we want a historical Jesus for a variety of reasons. A lot of it proof text for some belief that someone is holding, which is fine. Except if you look to these texts for confirmation, I think you're going to be disappointed once you start to realize everything we've been talking about, all the structural elements that come into play for understanding the literature. Really, the goal was to give you an impression of this person and their life and their character in a way that corresponded with literary expectation of its era. And that's very different from trying to understand, what did Jesus actually say? Did he say this? Did he say that? Where did he go? What's the geography? You're just going to be disappointed if you hang on to that.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.